Shh. Hear that? Big waves are calling. Dive into refreshment with Kona Big Wave. Tropical flavor and the taste of aloha in every drop. So crack one open and let the great taste roll in. Kona Big Wave, liquid aloha. Copyright 2025 Kona Brewing Co., St. Louis, Missouri. Mahalo for enjoying responsibly.
Abercrombie's viral denim sale is back, and Spotify listeners get an extra 15% off with code SPOTIFYAF. Abercrombie is known for their denim. With 30 to 50% off all jeans, find out how denim should fit. Shop the viral denim sale in the Abercrombie app, online, or in stores. Valid in stores and online through August 11th, 2025 in US and Canada. Excludes clearance, price reflects discount. Code valid in US and Canada through August 11th, 2025. Exclusions apply. See details online.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And the other one, Neil Bow.
And this week we're discussing a certified survival horror classic, that being 1995's Clock Tower, as we examine the recently released remaster of the game, Clock Tower Rewind, from developer WayForward in conjunction with Limited Run Games. For those that are unaware, Clock Tower focuses on orphan Jennifer's new home of the Barrow family's mansion, known as the Clock Tower, which turns into a deadly game of cat and mouse as a mad child wielding shear-like scissors, thus being known as the Scissor Man, roams the halls stalking her and the other members of the household. So, Neil, as of late, it seems like we just can't stop yapping about point-and-click horror games, but, you know, Clock Tower is certainly deserving of another point-and-click focused chat, given that its influence amongst the survival horror genre is pretty important, part of that history again. But I think most importantly, like, this was a game that was virtually unplayable before the Rewind remaster, was it not?
Yeah, I think apart from like fan remakes, effectively, that was it. You know, it was Japan only in many cases. So many people like myself came to the series much later, and by which time, of course, as we've said with many games like Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil arrived, and Silent Hill arrived, and those earlier sort of efforts kind of got left by the wayside a bit. But so yeah, when that sort of remaster Clock Tower Rewind was announced, it was like, oh, okay, so finally a chance to sort of play it. It's been one of those ones I'd not got around to for ages. So when we were talking, as you said, with all these point and clicky style things, it made sense to sort of finally get around to playing this for the first time, and see what it was all about.
Yeah, and I think that furthermore, something that we've chatted about a lot has been like the importance of remasters, and this being an example of one that, as you said, outside of fan efforts to make the original Clock Tower accessible, this is the first time that outside of Japan that this has been fully translated and released in not only its original form based upon, the different modes in this, which we can talk about, but more importantly, like, again, in terms of like preservation, it's quite important because, I, like you, was not super familiar with Clock Tower, but, the notion that this is the first time you've ever been able to play the original, because I believe that when this game was, I suppose, the first instance of Clock Tower being introduced in America, it was called Clock Tower on the PlayStation, but that was actually Clock Tower 2, not the original Clock Tower 1. So like, there's this weird sort of like history with this series, and the notion that you could like actually play this in both the original format, but also with the rewind features, which it'll be interesting to kind of get into that and talk about, what they add to the experience and whatnot. But I think for me, what was most notable right off the jump about Clock Tower was that this is a game that, has a lot of horror influence that is more Euro focused and centric, which, you know, you and I have talked plenty of times, primarily with Code Veronica, the Resident Evil game, about what makes that game so unique because of its more sort of like European flavor of horror. So for you, like with Clock Tower, how did that particular influence sort of like impart any uniqueness onto this one for you?
I think even from afar, it was very obvious, where the influences had been taken from. Yeah, I think the director of this, Hifumi Kono, he pretty much said at the time he loved Dario Argento movies, and
Mm.
that he wanted his film to kind of look like old horror movies. And the biggest, sort of obvious comparison is to Phenomena, which is now, what, Christ, 40 years old. And which it was only 10 years before this, but still that was so, Jennifer, the protagonist, is basically modeled on Jennifer Connelly's character in that, who was also called Jennifer, just to complete the Jennifer trifecta on that one. And there's other elements, like when they introduce the Scissorman, it's a bit like the Suspiria bit where the glass ceiling gets smashed through with that really colourful sort of glass, and just other little bits from all sorts of Argento films, especially. I think there's a bit of opera, there's a bit of Four Flies on Grey Velvet, a bit of Tenebrae as well. So it pays a lot of homage to Argento, and which is, given how striking Argento's films are, that's like a really sort of good place to go. And for 1995, I think it does a pretty good job of sort of depicting that sort of European horror style, down to the location, the kind of plot, the kind of weird twists and turns it takes. But it does feel like a licensed Dario Argento game in many ways, and frustrations probably with the game as well. In the same way that people can get frustrations with his film. So I think it's nice to see something homaging, something to the point of if it wasn't Argento, I think there'd be cease and desist kind of things going on with some of this stuff. But I think there was no problem there. But when you consider some of the stuff that did get that in the 80s and 90s, and this is kind of amazing it got away with it to the degree it did.
Absolutely. But I think also like that was the thing that I suppose, even if though I had not previously played Clock Tower, that was something that again was like bridging this gap between my love of film and my love of obviously horror games. But I think also that it's an example of like, sure, you could use some of those influences from film directly and whatnot, but at the same time, it's an example of a game that like, it's not just that, right? It's not just this sort of like adaptation of Phenomena. It's taking some of those elements and those influences, but it's really expanding on those in a way that I think is different in some pretty fundamental ways. And more importantly, like they're able to introduce aspects that make Clock Tower, its own entity, essentially, that could be, judged independently from those sort of influences. I guess first and foremost for me, like with the Euro influence, I think that's a big factor in the result of this game having some like really gorgeous 2D art for those backgrounds, and it being, not only brooding and whatnot, but like very Gothic-esque. I think like that color palette is really tremendous, and it just makes, I think it's like evoking a lot of, I suppose if you're going to look backwards, like it's evoking a lot of like Spencer Mansion, but it's done so in a way that it feels, I suppose, like you get that good sense of like depth to the environments and whatnot. And it makes each one of those sections of mansion that you're investigating feel like its own distinguishable part of a larger building, essentially. And I just found overall, like the attention to detail to those environments was a big part of what allowed the Clock Tower mansion itself to like be this place that feels lived in, that feels like you're sort of like investigating the nooks and crannies of it, rather than a series of rooms that, this was kind of my experience with the original Alone in the Dark. It was like, okay, it's kind of just a series of rooms, but I didn't necessarily feel like that mansion has the same sense of identity perhaps that you have here. And that's pretty important when, much like mentioning Resi and Spencer Mansion, like you're going to do a fair bit of backtracking in Clock Tower. So that sort of environmental recognition is pretty important, given the ways in which the player is going to have to, explore and then retrace those steps throughout their time with the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange now when you look at it, when you think of games like Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil and how different they all are to each other in terms of approaching basically the same ideas. And if you think if Resident Evil's like the genesis of survival horror properly, this is probably closer to what we got in the 2010s, in terms of like the helpless sort of protagonists, having to evade everything and hide, which, and it's interesting that it's the 2D one that does that as well. But yeah, I think having it be two-dimensional, and using sprites and really utilizing the power that had by this point, because we were coming into the 3D generation and 2D had got so far already. But I think it gave it, the director, especially, the confidence to sort of make it a very particular kind of game, really to sort of find ways to make you feel those same sort of helpless feelings that you do in Resident Evil survival horror style. But using the controls in a particular way and really limiting what you can do to actually sort of help yourself out of the situation. So you really have to think, ahead of time what you might need. And the point and click side of this game means that we were already discussing this recently when we were with Sanitarium, where we were saying it was refreshing that it wasn't too convoluted, by 90s standards when it came to point and click, because so many of them were like, how would I ever in a million years figure this out? And there are bits in this where you only have limited things you can click on, which is fair enough, but it's still easy to miss stuff. And we'll probably get into why, because I think, there are aspects of this game in trying to be two things at once. It kind of doesn't sort of help it. But it's also good that it wasn't just like pure point and click. It was good that they tried to do something a bit different. But yeah, that's fine. It does what it needs to do with that, and it creates a great atmosphere, as you said, with the sprite work. And I think you needed to have like really striking environments if you're going to sort of ape Argento as well. So that definitely added something to it.
Yeah, and before we get too much into like the gameplay, I think it's definitely worth mentioning with the remaster, as I kind of mentioned briefly in the intro. So there's the original mode to play this game, but then there's also the rewind mode, which adds new features and some quality of life refinements along the lines of also some pretty substantial content from more of like a presentation standpoint. So, there's like this new really gorgeous animated opening to it. There's some like motion comics with voiceovers. There's a new theme song by, I believe, an artist that has done songs for the Silent Hill franchise previously. And then there's some like behind the scenes developer interviews and things along those lines, which I thought was, the types of things that they're extra, right? They're nice bonuses. But I think what was really interesting was spending time with both the original mode for a little bit, just so that I could get a classical feel for what Clock Tower was like. And then I went back and I kind of restarted with the rewind mode. And so that was a really interesting experience because of the fact that I found that with the original mode, I didn't necessarily have a lot of like grievances with the original way that game played. And I had an interesting time with perhaps some of the changes to gameplay with those new additions. And like, naturally, I don't have the benefit of having experienced the original mode in its entirety when it came out and whatnot to kind of like have a lot of stakes in Clock Tower as a series and whatnot. But I was curious, like for you, like, did you find any of those changes were like beneficial to the overall play of game? Did you find that they maybe like removed some of the challenge. Like, how did you kind of feel about some of those features?
Well, the rewind feature being like the main thing, as you said,
Yeah.
which is present in a lot of like retro remasters, especially of platformers where it's like, oh, okay, you made a mistake, you can rewind a little, and that's fine. But here I think they again make the right use of it, where you can only go so far back. So if you just dawdle and think, oh crap, I need to go out of this situation, if you really fucked it, you need to end up like dying effectively if you at that point, because your rewind won't take you back far enough to sort of fix everything. So which is good, because otherwise you're just messing with the whole thing. And you can save. It's not the end of the world. You can still save, but in a game where one wrong choice, it's an interesting way about going about it. Where you can just sort of, okay, I just want to quickly change this and see if I can get out of this situation, because with the way the game is, and the faults that come with it being 30 years old, it does mean that it needs that help sometimes, and it's not your fault if something goes amiss, because you are basically walking in treacle most of the time, and your decision making is going to be faster than everything that's happening on screen, and so that kind of clashes and causes there's moments of brain farts effectively, where you don't make the right decision because you have too much time to think about it, but not the right response time to think about it. And so I think the rewind feature is generous enough, and the little bits of extras that are in there that help. There's like a motion comic thing as well. I think it's Mary Elizabeth McGlynn who does the theme song thing. She's like quite an established voice actress. She's done a lot of like anime stuff like Ghost in the Shell, and I like that sort of animated intro as well. It's I think it was quite similar when stuff like Streets of Rage 4 had that like really stylish sort of opening that was really well animated, and it adds a bit of flavor. I mean, it doesn't do the game any favors, I suppose, because it's so different. Like, it's kind of jarring, like, to the thing. But it again shows up quite how much of a sort of Argento-based thing it is in that moment. But they're all little things to sort of package it nicely, and they have that little, basically an explainer sheet of like the controls and simple things. It's all it needs, because to control it and to do what you need to do in the game is technically simple, and it doesn't get to the point of being condescending where it's like, well, we basically ruined the point of this game. Because to be honest, if you went too far, you'd finish this game very, very quickly indeed, because it's just, but there is stuff in it where you go, there's no way I would have just figured that out just by looking at stuff and knowing what I'm going to use here and where I'm going to do that. And that's the thing. Like I said, your brain might figure out, you've got the time to figure it out, but your actions may not give you that time to figure it out. So it's an interesting set of systems to not mess with the game, I suppose, but give it just that little boost to help players out and make sure that they don't have this frustration to the level they could have.
Yeah, I would say for me, like the biggest thing, I suppose the largest addition that I don't have an issue with is like the manual saves, right? And maybe some purists have an issue with that, but I think ultimately, like, that's what stopped me from hitting a wall where I would just get super frustrated, because there's definitely instances when, the scissor man basically like corners you in a room, and then, if your stamina is not at the right point, or you haven't like gauged that rewind feature as perfectly as you could, like that could make for some pretty frustrating backtrack sections and whatnot, where you basically just have to like fully indefinitely run all the way back to one point and then kind of like try to maneuver around him in a room later, which kind of leads into one addition that I actually like, and that's the fact that the scissor man can follow Jennifer between rooms now, which is nice, I think, because of the fact that it doesn't let you ever feel too safe. The notion that like if you just ran to one room and then another room and then he kind of just like disappears or something along those lines, where you're kind of like cheesing the system almost. I actually do like that. It makes for that ever persistent kind of threat that that, kind of, again, not to always bring it up, but like with Resi getting pursued by like Mr. X or something like that. I do like that as a feature. And I think that, like you were kind of saying there at the end, this is a game that could be completed pretty quickly, but at the same time, like the Clocktower Mansion has that quality that is the best type of quality for an environment to have, which is that the more time you spend in it and the more time you're sort of discerning in how you interact with various sections, exploring every nook and cranny, you actually do get a lot more out of the game than if you're just kind of like, well, how do I escape? Because it is a game that has multiple, almost 10 endings. I believe it's got 9 possible endings. And, some of them are more definitive than others. Some of them are quite sudden. If the player attempts, like, I guess I'll just spoil it because I don't really care. It's this old of an experience, but it's like at one point you find a car and it's like, oh, a car, I can just get away. And like, yeah, that's not going to be for a very happy ending for Jennifer. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Like, it's the type of game that really rewards that exploration factor. I mean, there was an initial playthrough where I wasn't going through like that, where I wasn't exploring every nook and cranny. And I was like, I'm not really learning a lot about this environment. It's almost like picking up journal pages in Resi and kind of blowing through them and not reading anything. It's like, well, you're missing half of the reason to experience this. Like the setting itself is basically a character. And I think the same is true with Clocktower in that, if you spend more time investigating, looking for these little story tidbits, you'll access different parts of the mansion, which then begin to tell the story and the background of what's going on, which ultimately is just as interesting, if not more interesting, than Jennifer's story herself. So I found that to be incredibly rewarding from a just like environmental gameplay standpoint. The more that I kind of like went off the beaten path or took my time, I found that I ended up enjoying my time with this game a lot more, not from like a challenge perspective, but just like an environmental storytelling perspective. So I found that to be a great asset overall. One aspect of gameplay we've mentioned now that this is a not only point and click horror game, but it also has survival horror elements. I think for me, like those survival horror elements are what make this, I suppose it provides like sort of a blueprint of sorts that I'm surprised, or at least I haven't seen a great deal of point and click horror games that kind of have that aspect of, oh, I'm fleeing something. I need to be avoiding an active threat on top of trying to solve these puzzles. And again, like meticulously exploring environments and combining items to solve those environmental puzzles.
Eczema isn't always obvious, but it's real. And so is the relief from Ebglyss. After an initial dosing phase, about 4 in 10 people taking Ebglyss achieved itch relief and clear or almost clear skin at 16 weeks. And most of those people maintain skin that's still more clear at 1 year with monthly dosing.
Ebglyss, lebrikizumab LBKZ, a 250 milligram per 2 milliliter injection, is a prescription medicine used to treat adults and children 12 years of age and older who weigh at least 88 pounds or 40 kilograms with moderate to severe eczema, also called atopic dermatitis, that is not well controlled with prescription therapies used on the skin or topicals, or who cannot use topical therapies. Ebglyss can be used with or without topical corticosteroids. Don't use if you're allergic to Ebglyss. Allergic reactions can occur that can be severe. Eye problems can occur. Tell your doctor if you have new or worsening eye problems. You should not receive a live vaccine when treated with Ebglyss. Before starting Ebglyss, tell your doctor if you have a parasitic infection.
Searching for real relief? Ask your doctor about Ebglyss and visit ebglyss.lilly.com or call 1-800-LILY-RX or 1-800-545-5979.
Are you ready to dairy-free your mind? This summer, melt away your dairy-free expectations with So Delicious dairy-free frozen desserts. Enjoy mind-blowing flavors like salted caramel cluster, chocolate cookies and cream, cookie dough, and more. For over 35 years, So Delicious has been cranking up the flavor with show-stopping products that are 100% dairy-free, certified vegan by Vegan Action, and are so unbelievably creamy, your taste buds will do a double take. Dairy-free your mind. Visit SoDeliciousDairyFree.com.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah, I mean that you do just think of a point and click adventure being quite mellow in terms of like pacing. Again, like we have been talking lots about these recently, and the Drifter was one where we were saying how it's great, how it was quite swift and for a point and click. But even then, you can just stand around and do nothing and think about stuff, like that. Rare you can do that here. Like even like the act of letting Jennifer rest to basically up her stamina again, like it feels like a risk, like to just stop. And this is what I'm saying, and it's finding that balance of like figuring out room to room and really looking at what you've got in that room and working out how it works together and working out how it might benefit you later. So you had that room with the 2 beds and with the mirror and the bird, and that one, there's several ways you can approach it, but not every way is right. But the beds are like have multiple uses, but one of them is a hiding spot, one of them is you can use the sheet for a puzzle, and these are things like I said, you have to look at each room like that and think, okay, I see stuff in this room, how could it help me? And as much as we say point and click stuff, it's never always that simple and obvious. But it's like, okay, there's an item here, what the hell is this for? Like that. There's still a lot of like, here's a key, here's a key, here's a key. And it's like, cool, that's all I need, sort of thing. But I think the use of like the survival horror mechanics here, especially in terms of like hiding and outsmarting a pursuing force in a 2D environment, is the interesting thing, because you can't sort of wiggle around them. You can briefly sort of fight the Scissor Man off for a bit, but you can only really use that once in a row because it really knocks your stamina off, and that's not going to help you. But I mean, usually you do like get that sort of musical stab telling you that the Scissor Man is going to appear at some point soon. And I do like that in terms of like a horror experience, because sometimes it's like it's really obvious where he's going to come from, but you still have to go towards that place or open that door or go through this hole and know that that's what you're going to be confronted with. So you kind of prepare yourself. And again, it makes you look at the environments around you've just been through and where you're going to sort of go, yeah, okay, so this might be helpful. And again, this is why it's so important to sort of learn the layout of the mansion, because if you don't, you will just get lost very quickly and end up stumbling straight into those shears, and that's what you don't want. And like I said, the rewind function will only do so much to help you in that regard. If you make a bad decision, sometimes you don't realize it if you're in a blind panic. But it really does pay to sort of pay attention and figure things out in a certain order to get the best possible outcomes. But I suppose there is where it does feel like a movie sort of style of chase scenes and stuff, where you do just, it very much is like, well, you think of games like Until Dawn later that would come, that would really give you that sort of movie style choice. This is like the progenitor of that, because you are just making that choice. What would you do in this horror movie situation? Would you hide under the bed, or would you run into this room, and would you use this item? And it's like, would you think to use this item in this situation? And that's the cool thing about it. And because there are just such limited options, and you don't really know every time when you've got an option, it is actually quite great when you sort of have that moment in your head and you're like, oh, I get it. What if I try this? And it works like that. Especially in those sort of rewind, try again situations where you like, I want to try this thing out, see if this works, and if it doesn't work, great, rewind, try something else, sort of thing. That I didn't mind. That's probably where it really helped the most, where you had that sort of experimentation in doing that.
And I think that the aspect of this game that allows that survival horror chase hiding mechanic to work as well as it does on subsequent replays is the fact that, as I mentioned, this game has 9 possible endings. Now, I'm not somebody that I'm not going to play a game 9 different times, but I could see myself playing this game more than once or twice because of the fact that this game also has the aspect of items randomly generating within environments. And it also has, which is probably the first game that I would have encountered jump scares at had I played this upon release, and that being jump scares that are randomized as well. So like there is that aspect of replayability here that I think even like the original Resi might have had at one point, when you could have items pop up in different sections of the mansion and whatnot. But like that aspect of the randomizing of scares and key items for solving puzzles, like that adds more credence, I suppose, to those survival mechanics, because it is constantly having the player worry about multiple things at a single time. And you can't really rely on your prior knowledge other than, you know, the layout of rooms, but not the layout of items, given again, that randomly generating nature of them. And so, you know, for me, I find that that's an aspect that really did surprise me because of that. You know, usually I figured like, well, this type of thing I'm going to play once, and then once you kind of have the things memorized, I don't know if I'm going to always come back to like experience the puzzles, because it's something I guess we can chat about in a little bit, but like the puzzles are not the draw here for me. So having that survival aspect of it, having to manage not only your stamina, not only your health, but also just like keeping an eye out for places and environments you can hide. It adds that sort of like laundry list approach to things that the player always has to be kind of like focused on. Otherwise, you know, you're going to find yourself in a panic mode when your vitals are already low, and then, you know, that's going to be lights out for Jennifer. So I think for me, like that's a great way for a game to have tension, have obviously the standards of a point and click adventure game from a puzzle perspective and the exploration aspect. But I just found that like, while those survival horror mechanics and I suppose the actual managing of your stamina sometimes can be a little hit or miss, I think overall, like it adds a nice layer of tension and intensity to it. So you can't just kind of like dilly-dally around. And you never know what part of the environment you interact with next is going to be a hiding spot for the Scissor Man, which I think the sort of like full circleness of exploring and investigating, but not doing so kind of like at your will, in terms of like, oh, I'm just going to like click here, I'll click there, I'll click there. Like you do have to think about these things a little bit more thoroughly than just like going about your day.
Yeah, like I said, as much as there are just like, here's a key, there's a key, there's like, I do go back to that thing, like you just pick up certain items and you're not quite sure what you're supposed to do with them. And often the answer is you don't know yet, sort of thing. Like that, I mean, you could rip the hole in the idea of like, well, why would you pick it up anyway then if you don't know what it's for, sort of thing. You know, like why pick up this rock, for instance? Like in that instance, you know, the solution isn't too far away, but it's like it's still a bit baffling in terms of like logic, where you go, well, don't need to. But then you could say that of most survival horror games, where it's like, well, I'll pick this weird fucking item up for no reason, just because it's weird. I don't know that it's important, but we'll do it anyway. There's a bit of that, which is fine. I mean, what Rewind does is sort of make things a little faster in terms of like stamina stuff, and that's fine. And I mean, it just shows you how laborious it must have been for the original mode if that's fast. But
yeah,
but
that was the number one thing that made me end my original mode playthrough earlier than I anticipated and just dive into Rewind, because I was just kind of like, this laborious nature of kind of just like shuffling around. It's that maybe inflated the runtime of this one in that regard.
Yeah, and so you know it is what it is, though. We can't do much about that.
Yeah. But to be fair, it does speak to like, there are some aspects in a remaster or a remake that you can kind of throw into the works in terms of like her moving up stairs faster, and you know, the sort of like regenerating stamina a little bit. Again, those are things that I think made this less frustrating for me, and I think that I definitely don't mind some of those things. But granted, you and I don't have the same history, I suppose, that some people do with the series, but that's fine all the same. I'm not too worried about that. I suppose in terms of like the one thing that did annoy me a lot about the Rewind feature, which is, you know, periodically you're going to be unlocking various concept art and whatnot. Like for the life of me, I couldn't find a workaround for this, but sometimes when you unlock artwork, you get this massive notification that pops up that says like, oh, you've unlocked whatever, some type of artwork or behind the scenes scribblings and stuff. And it fills the entire screen. And it's just one of those things that, like, for as gorgeous as this game is, and as much as you're kind of like soaking up these environments, to have this massive, like, just basically big gold letters fill up the entire screen to say this, you're just like, okay, that just like snapped me out of it a little bit. Like, you could have just had the words up in like the lower right or something like that. It doesn't need to be like this show stopping moment.
Well, yeah, it's like the Scissor Man and like entrance. Like, not only did that come up, but the trophy ping at the same time. It was like the screen was just like half obscured. It's like, why? This is a big moment. It's like that shouldn't be on by default. Sorry, it's like if you could do that, you do it in the aftermath. I know that's hard because then that's when you're doing the chase stuff. But find a way that doesn't like block the screen of like the thing you're trying to show off. It's all very well to go, all these things you can look at. And it's like, yeah, but I'm trying to look at this now. And I know it's because of the kind of game it is, and maybe trying to treat it for a modern audience and saying, oh, here's little things you unlock, here's little things, and but it felt that was like overkill for you when you're getting that coming up and achievement trophies unlocking as well. Oh, for God's sake, it's like, it would just be like, actually, it's not too dissimilar to like if you're watching a film on like PlayStation and you get like something's just installed and just get that loud blang and like the notification in the corner just saying that it's there. Like, oh, it reminds me I'm watching this on a console. Thank you, sort of thing. But somehow more intrusive.
I suppose, we chatted briefly about it, but how did you feel about some of the puzzles in this game? Because I found, let me know what you thought about that, and then I'll share what I thought, because those were maybe a little bit of a sticking point for me.
Well, I've kind of been sort of going around the houses about it and saying that, again, this is a game where you do have those sort of, what am I supposed to do with this sort of moments, and that's very much true of the puzzles as well, where you do just have this, okay, how does this work out? And very much born of like point and click adventures of that time, in terms of like the answer to things being a little bit too obscure, or in some cases just like kind of pointless. Like, it's understandable, and I get that. Again, this is the fight it's having, where it wants to be both things, and we don't really know what one of those things is yet properly in terms of like survival horror, because it's still new. And it's like, as we were just saying before, different games were trying different things to make that. But point and click, we know the rules to that. And compared to now, where you can just chuck a bunch of genres together, and it's like, oh, cool, this works with this and this, because we've had years and decades and decades of experience with doing that. But even in the 90s, it was like to try and mix two genres together just felt wrong like that. And this is definitely part of it, I think, where you do just, I think it may just be because of the nature of it, where it doesn't need to be quite as point and clicky. And I think this is where Resident Evil kind of pushes it forward a bit and makes that whole idea of the puzzles worthwhile at the environment. And I think that's transition to 3D helps in that regard, I suppose. But yeah, they're nothing I'm going to be writing home about, and they kind of frustrate in the wrong way, I think, because the pacing is different for this game because of what we said, where you don't really have the time to think in the same way you do. Simpler puzzles feel more complicated because you are constantly thinking, well, I can't really stand around and wonder about this stuff. And yes, you can pause the game, but it's that's not really the point, is it? It's not that kind of puzzling.
Yeah, I think for me, one aspect of it that was a little frustrating, and I think might not even be worth talking about, just because it's like it's a byproduct of the era for which it was designed. But like, if you don't click items in the environment in the correct order, then it won't properly trigger sometimes. Like there was one section when, you find a gap in the floor and then there's a board on the wall, but you have to look at, I think it's the order is the problem and then the solution and then the solution back to the problem. I think that's how it went. And, if I clicked on the board first and then clicked on the gap, it wouldn't do anything. And so it was one of those things where the first time I came to that, I was kind of just like, oh, well, do I just need to look for a different piece of wood or something like that? And then it was just through frustration of just clicking back and forth and then doing that in the right order after that and being like, oh, okay, like that taught me that. But that wasn't as intuitive as I would have hoped. And I think when you have those moments of tension sometimes and you're being pursued, like that I maybe works in that instance. But like if I'm not being pursued and I just come across a puzzle like that, that made some instances of that maybe a little more indicative of what I think we chatted about last week with Sanitarium, like the notion of some 90s puzzle trauma. So that was maybe an instance of that for me.
Yeah. And I think another part of that is just the general movement is just so slow. And even with the slight speeding up, the kind of a rewind. And I mean, even text, like the way text is presented is just like, if you're going to fix things, I think that was something where I think you maybe could have reconfigured the text a bit, because there's cut-offs in sentences that don't really work, and you're waiting for words that are coming, and it's just like, many a game still do that to this day, to be fair. But yeah, I think given everything else with the game, it frustrates, when you just kind of just get on with it. And it's like, it's not really the game's fault. It's in trying to sort of make it a bit more accessible and do workarounds for its pacing, and for the fact that it is this sort of awkward, fumbling thing born of two different genres. But it still shows, it's still a problem. And it's like, the whole, I think it's because you have control over the movement to a degree by pressing the shoulder button, the front shoulder buttons, or hold, to go left, right. Or it feels like you're in control, but not. And because you can't change much about the speed of it, it's like you kind of want more control, like that. Something about the game screams to you, this doesn't need to be a point and click adventure at times. Like it needs to be, a side-scrolling 2D platformer. And that's, again, not the game's fault. I think it's because we've had plenty of 2D platforming puzzle games that you wouldn't think are like the immediate legacy of this, but you think of, Playdead's, Limbo and Inside, which are like almost like the modern sort of versions of this in terms of like 2D, puzzling. Just where they just take the point and click stuff out of it and make it more. They do what Resident Evil did and have this more, tactile sort of version of doing puzzling, and that's perfectly fine. So yeah, it really does just get caught in those problems.
Yeah, I suppose also that kind of leads into just like overall encountering the Scissor Man. Because while, like I said, I love those randomized moments, those kind of jump scare moments, it does add a good amount of tension to just the way in which and hesitancy the player needs to have when exploring environments. I just found though that sometimes like it was a little frustrating when you get boxed into a corner, right? And there is, I think, the only instance where you can really like fight back other than struggling when you have full stamina is like you could pick up like a shovel at one point and hit him and knock him over. But at the same time, like that sort of like loop of having to backtrack or, rewinding to the degree that you have a point of escape. There were some instances where that, when you pair that with like the movement speed, it made some instances pretty frustrating because I'm thinking to myself like, okay, now I have to backtrack for like 5 minutes basically to try to outrun him or get to a section of an environment that's a little bit easier to maneuver past him and whatnot. But I suppose also like the new stamina regeneration stuff makes that a little bit less of a pill because your stamina is not as, low all the time now because of how quickly you can get it to replenish. But yeah, I suppose the Scissor Man stuff was like kind of a double-edged sword for me because of some of the frustration there. Yeah, little dude.
Yeah, I mean, I like it as an antagonist. It's great, and it's again, just multiple different sort of Argento things pushed together. Especially like the phenomena sort of reveal thing, baddie.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a shame to have that because, but again, this is early in the sort of genesis of the idea of the stalker character, and again, can't fault it for what it is sometimes because knowing it's going to help lead games in a certain way. And yeah, that's just it. You learn your lessons from games like this in a regard, and there are powerful things to take away from this. And when they do have moments that are like set piece moments of him appearing, they are really effective as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because, like I said, because they build up nicely, and like I said, you expect him like that, and then there he is. My favorite one is that like, what is it? You're basically looking at sort of draw that cupboardy thing, and he's just like looming in the shadows of it, and then just comes out of it. And it's like, yeah, and the music kicks in, and I said that it's just one of those cool, real, proper Argento style moments where like this soundtrack that shouldn't work, like clashing with like the mad visuals where everything's just chaos, and panic, and yeah, it really captures that perfectly. So yeah, I mean, you can see why like the character is like one of horror gaming's most beloved sort of villains, if you will, because it's taking that sort of giallo style imagery and something, big sharp blades and decapitating women is especially an Argento fetish, so to speak. So yeah, you can see that, and given he's like just one part of like the villainy in this game, depending on where you go. With the mystery at the heart of this, if you've seen any Argento films, kind of is like really bloody obvious, especially if you've seen Phenomena, because it's like, oh, why has this person disappeared? Like sort of thing, and it's like, yeah, okay, we get it. And that character's end is quite interesting if you do things a certain way. But I do like when the game sort of goes in these little supernatural side bits, like when I talk about that room with the beds, like if you interact with the mirror, like a fucking hand comes out of it, and it's just like, what? It's like, it's just things that I like that because again, it goes into that sort of like Italian flavor of horror, where it's like, oh yeah, there'll just be stuff that doesn't make sense, but we don't have to make sense of everything like that. We can give you just enough information, more Fulci than Argento in that regard, but yeah, I love that. And there's towards the end, one of the end, the reveal of like that thing behind the big curtain is just like, what the fuck? Yeah, like again, when I say like Limbo and Inside, it's like a reverse sort of thing of that, I suppose. And yeah, it does just feel like a proper what the fuck moment. And that's what this game does well with its villains and its monsters, is just surprise you, like that. As much as there is frustration in there, it's a game that probably kept that tension in a way I didn't expect it to for quite a long time.
I think that again, like when you come back to a game that when you explore and interact with as much as you can, you do get those moments that kind of just like, even now, I think, and that's a testament to just like how ahead of this time the game was, and just like how influential it is in that, you're taking those qualities of a horror film and actually putting it into a game itself. And I think that again, like is one of those aspects of the design of Clock Tower that allows it to be more than just, Phenomena inspired the game, right? It's like, no, they're able to actually take those components of film and apply it in a way that previously we'd only ever experienced really in film. And so to have those moments in a game that also has naturally the inherent tactile nature of games and the problem solving and the, I suppose in this instance, like escaping features, not combat, but the ability to escape and whatnot. That's what makes this a full-fledged experience that I think really does kind of like take the best elements of film, but then make them blend with the inherent parts of being a point and click horror game that also has those survival horror elements to it. I mean, overall, like, what did you think about the story for Clock Tower? As we've kind of talked about the environmental storytelling, but overall, like, what did you kind of think about it?
Yeah, like I was saying before, if you've watched any Argentos, where it's going in some ways, you will know, I think, and also because the game doesn't really hide that very well. I think from just that's the way storytelling in games has probably grown a bit. That you're not really getting clues and context in the same way you do now. And of course, this is not really a text log sort of thing. So yeah, like the overarching why and who done it sort of nature of it is there and easy to get. But like I said, it by going in this sort of place where you use the environment to tell a lot of the story, by just having all these dilapidated things and like going into these rooms and having little like clues as to what's going on, like when you find that room full of butchered crows, for instance, and just some cool little moments like that. Again, using sort of the pixel detail to sort of give you a flavor of the madness that's sort of been brewing in the background of this place. And one of the things they do quite well actually early on is when the girls are sort of conversing about like coming here, just to live, and they're all uncomfortable about it already, before anything's happened, like that. And it's like, I mean, what you can see of it already is like, it does look a bit off and a bit strange. And again, that's probably just through history and mansions and horror games. It's like, you expect that. Of course, it's ingrained in your head that it's going to be a bad time. But even when they do that sort of intro sort of thing with the little sort of tool sort of animation scenes, and when you see that the place for the first time, it's like, perfectly framed as being like, this place is not going to be a good time sort of thing. But each individual room has a little bit of that in it and gives you some idea of like something you aren't quite sure about. And that's really where you garner most of the story thing. The objective is clear in this game. It's like, you're all orphans, so you're all technically like sisters. So it makes sense you'd want to find them as much as you want to get out, and so that kind of drives the logic of still being around, and not just trying to find a way out necessarily for yourself. But and then of course, as a result, you kind of bump into what the story is going to tell you and show you. And I like that about it. It's like you aren't really like searching for the truth, so to speak, apart from in terms of like finding your orphan sisters, if you will. You are kind of stumbling onto the things about the place, and you are just there and experiencing it as you go. And I do like that. Right down to the end, you are just walking into situations where, oh my god, like that. And so in terms of like recreating that sort of weird dream-like thing of like 70s and 80s, so Italian horror, it does a great job of like just being weird, offbeat, violent, and it not really being about the twist or the revelation, it just being about what mad shit are we going to show you at the end sort of thing. And that works.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, like what I loved so much about the game was that again, I didn't have a background with this game, but I think that my understanding of the depth of it was becoming evident in like real time. The more that I was finding out, oh no, this is more than just getting chased by a creepy kid. Like there is this true backstory, and you are going to find the reasons why some of these things are happening and whatnot. And that I think overall just makes for like a richer experience in the long run. Like sometimes when I go back and I play classic games, I'm almost taken aback by a lack of, storytelling sometimes, or I find maybe that if I have less context for what I'm doing, I'm not always as engaged. And so to have a game where early on I'm engaged from the gameplay side of things because of this blending of both point and click and survival horror, but then finding that there is this deeper underroot narrative of what's going on, and there is more to be uncovered about that mansion and the happenings and the relations between characters, like that kind of just like fueled my the rest of my playthrough of the game and making me drive to that ending other than just like escape. I think that makes for an experience for me that's a little bit more worthwhile. And that isn't always to say like, I need every single question answered, as we've said previous times when in regards to storytelling and horror primarily. But that just adds a little bit more, I suppose, flavor to the world in a way that I find to be meaningful, other than, just try to escape. Because it's the thing where it's like with the combination of the manual saves and just experimenting with the world, when I found that initial early escape option, it was one of those things when you realize like how sudden it is and how, not really concluding any one particular story beat. It kind of just makes me laugh at, oh, well, shit, how many characters have I seen that happen to in a horror movie before? I should have known better. And like that being one of those early examples of an understanding of film and being a homage to film and including those moments. But the game itself is not just built up along those kind of like chuckling moments like, oh, well, that's a horror movie moment kind of a thing. It's just nice to have like an inclusion here and inclusion there. But then you have actually a narrative that is telling its own story and has its own conclusion points, whether it's always for the good of the protagonist or not remains to be seen. But I'm just kind of like thankful for a multi-fledged experience in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it's considering it is 30 years old and we know how creaky some of the stories in some of those games can be. If you judge it by survival horror standards, yeah, fine, okay. But I think it's like, if you were to sort of compare it to some of the point and click stuff, maybe it's viewed as a bit weaker. But I think the thing you really want to view it as is like, a giallo or like an Italian horror. That's how you look at it in terms of what you should be getting out of the plot, and in that regard, it is a success. And so, but I can see how you could look at it in the other ways and go, well, it's not very good for a point and click adventure, or it's okay for a survival horror thing. But yeah, it is mostly about vibes and feeling and like really getting the panic and the madness stuff, and that's what it does well. So yeah, not everything has to be like a brooding introspection of the psyche sort of thing. It can just be bright colors, people being chased by people with giant scissors, and that's it.
We don't have to examine every aspect of Jennifer's psychological trauma. Like, it doesn't always have to be based in grief or trauma. It could just be, a woman being chased by a crazy killer.
Yeah, I mean, Christ, everything in here is tame and underexplained compared to the influence point in Phenomena, which is Jennifer Connelly can talk to bugs and Donald Pleasance has a monkey butler, and that gets revenge with a straight razor. So it's this is very simple by comparison, and probably for the best, because I don't think that would have endeared itself to any audience in the West if it had come over.
Now I need to go back and rewatch Phenomena because I completely forgot about the monkey somehow.
The monkey. Vengeance monkey.
But in wrapping up, are there any last minute points that you had about Clock Tower Rewind, or how Way Forward and Limited Run Games kind of handled this remaster of a classic?
Yeah, I think generally they've tried their best to sort of keep it as it was and not mess with it too much. I suppose it's looking into just how to make that experience less intrusive, as we said, with notifications, things like that, and knowing when to sort of, I suppose, looking, for Limited Run, being one of the things of that company is, like doing physical games for games that don't normally get them, and that's great, and that's a wonderful thing to have. But in that, you should learn that curating these things properly is important, and gimmicks and features are great in helping new audiences sort of get into a game, but you have to make sure they don't mess with the game, not just mechanically but visually. And that notification system is definitely something where it's like, hey, hang on, that's not giving a good impression. I mean, I don't think you could do much more without spoiling what the game is, that, as much as it's frustrating at times and a curio in others because it is 30 years old, and even with the little tweaks and changes here, it's very sedate, in terms of like how it moves, and that's really at odds with the game you're playing. Great for like the tension and the panic, but frustrating when you stumbling through things, not really getting where you want to get. So yeah, it's finding that balance, I suppose. And we've seen games that have done a good job in other ways in this, but yeah, I quite respect how they've handled it. Yeah, and there's some good stuff, with it as well in terms of like extras, like the interview with the creator as well is like nice to see. His enthusiasm for horror is great. I know developers making horror games is one thing, but like when you see them sort of talking about horror in general on an outside sort of style, it's quite fun. So yeah, it kind of makes me want a new Clock Tower as well, just because it's much like Alone in the Dark. It's a series that kind of, by the time it got really to people in the West properly on a wider audience, they'd already fucked it, and it's like with this, Clock Tower had kind of fallen into the background, and Capcom team, they did what they did, and it's quite interesting, I think, in terms of Capcom's publishing as well. This and Resident Evil in such short space of time, and kind of like hedging their bets a bit, which is I don't even know who owns it anymore either, because it's like it's like I assume Capcom still have involvement given that they're on the credits still, but it's I'd like to see more, that's for sure.
Yeah, I guess that's a great point you make about just like overall as a package. I think especially being able to have the developer interview on that is just like fantastic, because of the fact that, you get to hear straight from the person that has now this, 30 years of living with it and other work that they've done in these things. And I don't know, sometimes you do see it in other ways. Like you get to see either magazines or whatnot that are crowdfunded, or you get to see some kind of like documentary that's been made online or something, but like just getting to see people that were there from the beginning, being able to reflect and seeing their love for horror still come through in a way that doesn't always have to be just games, but horror in general. It kind of just even further instills like how special this game was when it came out. And the fact that, this game really did like live and breathe horror in a way that was not super common in 95. And we get to see, that influence, and it just kind of shines through a little bit more after getting to listen to somebody kind of just get to share their love, which based upon the quality of that interview, like has not diminished in the 30 years since this game or whatnot. So yeah, it's a great package in that regard. And I think even like it's a little thing, but since the game has a smaller aspect ratio, like you get some really gorgeous artwork that you can have on the borders of it, which I thought was kind of just like a nice touch. And I think that intro, even that you get, that intro video is great as well. Some really gorgeous animation and whatnot. But yeah, it's just a nice all around remaster package that I think, again, like I started the episode giving it praise for. I think that the addition of having the original mode for me is something that I'm not necessarily going to use, but it's a massive deal that I think that that's included. It reminded me about the Secret of Monkey Island remake that they did years ago now. It's probably like 10 years ago, but that had a feature that we've seen in other remakes and remasters that allow you to switch between the remake graphics, but then the old graphical style as well. Like very seamlessly. Like that was such a cool feature. And that's something that really like jump started my sort of like beating this drum and getting on my soapbox every once in a while about remasters and remakes, because I was someone that had never played Secrets of Monkey Island, but I still was interested in getting to see what that original game was like with the original music, the original sound, and then being able to like snap back and forth between these two different perspectives of classic and contemporary. That is just like through and through clearly a labor of love. And as again, very important example of just being able to preserve games in a way that, it's showing it in its original format, but that's not always going to be for everyone. So I think that it's very important here that, Clock Tower Rewind had that feature. Granted, not graphically speaking, but more from a gameplay side of things, which still allows the sort of revolutionary nature of the gameplay here for Clock Tower and how influential that was, but being cognizant of the fact that, you know, a modern audience is not always going to jive with perhaps some aspects of gameplay that have not withstood the test of time as well as some others perhaps. But I just love that balancing of choice, right? It always comes down to that. More choice for players is never a bad thing. So yeah, it was nice to get to play this for the very first time with some of those more modern additions, both presentation and gameplay wise.
Yeah, and I will say, you know, I know when it comes to the sequels ever getting ports as well, the problem with the immediate 2 sequels is they are like even more awkward because they take the transition to 3D and they still try and keep the point and click stuff, and it doesn't always work. And of course, really, I think it was by Clock Tower 3, which is, you know, PS2 era, that we had like it be more like what we know survival horror to be. But yeah, that and the obvious one, Haunting Ground, you know, which was, you know, that sort of spiritual successor. You know, I think it'd be great if we had more like that. I think what was it? Nightcry, they said, was like the last spiritual successor we had, which it was 2016, which I think was the same. Yeah, it was Hifumi Kono as well who did that one. That was a Vita game. Yeah, I remember playing that. Christ, it's like, that's crazy. Yeah, it's like it only comes to me now though. So that's yeah, but
looks like that's on Steam.
Oh, there you go. Then. So I'll have to look into that at some point. But and it had Masahiro Ito involved in the art as well. So yeah, I mean that's still point and click as well, as I remember. So yeah, it's still keeping sort of roots of it. So it's not been that long, I suppose, since we've had the series around. But you know, there's plenty of the 3D later ones and like influences one, especially Capcom have like got the say so to say, yeah, why not? And great, then we can have more of that. Maybe pack in 2 and that into the struggle within into that sort of package as a, you know, not bare bones but like minimalized sort of ports, if you will, because I don't know, they could probably do with improving, but I think visually they just don't really stand up in the same way that like the first one and the third one, which is actually the fourth one, sort of do.
Yeah, if anything, it just makes me want that Haunting Ground or, you know, remaster or remake at some point, because I'm not shelling out 200 bones for a PS2 copy, and that might be on the low end. We know what that resale market's like for some of these games and that sort of like genre, right? But no, I think I was just happy again to have the opportunity to chat about this game this week, because while we can't seem to get away from point and click adventures, not that it's a bad thing, recently, I think that again, like the blending of genres here was really, really interesting, and just seeing how that kind of like was able to take aspects of both subgenres and blending them together into something like, it makes me hopeful that, you know, future down the line, with some more point and click adventure games, that we can get a little bit more of a return to this blending of the 2 genres, like kind of this hybrid. Because I think that's something that, again, like when you're talking about, as we were with the Drifter, like modernizing a genre a little bit, I think that that's an aspect that could definitely be examined in the future. And that's not to say like it's a necessity, but I think that there could be some growth there in terms of, you know, new norms, if you will, for point and click adventure games that could have some survival elements, which, you know, we saw a little bit with the Drifter, right? When you have those moments of, if you don't solve this puzzle in a timely fashion, you'll die. But something that maybe even adds a little bit more tension, if you will, along the horror route of things. But, you know, we'll see. As I've learned this week on Twitter, going through and just like following a lot more indie developers and things, there's a ton of point and click, both horror and adjacent games out there. So who's to say we won't have something along those lines in the future? But that'll do it for our chat on Clock Tower Rewind this week. And as always, my friend, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.